want to go through with you. Oh, okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you to come for this. It's a free session. It started by us, Caitlin and I reading a report from the English regulator on their tenant satisfaction measures. I'll go into what that is in a minute. And we were like, that's interesting. I think there's things we could learn from this for Wales. They have a different regulatory system, but I still think there's some lessons here. And I'd like to go through what I took away and what I learned and see what your views are. And if you don't agree, sorry, I've wasted your lunch. But I'm hoping you're going to get some ideas and some thoughts out of this. So, as I said already, a lot of you know already who I am. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm David Wilson. But Caitlin joined us in November, and she'll be supporting this session today. So the first thing I want to say is, in case you're not familiar, there's a little bit of just setting the scene. Since the late 90s, since the evolution of devolution, is a word. The regulation across the four nations has gone slightly different paths, different directions depending on the government at the time and policy. I don't want to go into a lot of it, but I think there's a couple of fundamentals I thought were essential today, especially if we've got local authority members here today. So the first thing is Scotland is local authorities are included in that regulation, and the regulator is a standalone organisation. It's still a government division, but it's like, it is the Scottish housing regulator. And one thing I've always been a big fan of them is they're very good at that transparency of data for comparisons. There's flaws in comparison stuff, but they're very good. There's some lovely tools you can filter. If you're like picking up Ross there, you can pick Merthyr Valley, Merthyr Tydfil, the nearest local authority, and you can do some really nice, easy comparisons. And they were doing this 10 years ago. Northern Ireland, very different as you'd expect there. No local authority housing at all. In fact, the Northern Ireland government own nearly all social homes. They're 85% of them. There is a small emerging, since things have changed in Northern Ireland, small emerging housing association presence. But really, the executive are the social housing in Northern Ireland. They're the regulator, the funder, policy, everything. And in Wales, as you know, the regulator is an internal department of Welsh government. Local authorities are not included. There's sporadic Audit Wales visits, but again, Audit Wales, hasn't had the funding and the resources to maybe do as much as they could. And Welsh housing associations, you're probably familiar with this, are judged on two standards, because this is important when we're going to look at England. We have governance and financial viability. I'm not going to dwell on that, because if we want to do something on Welsh standards, what we've learned, we can do a separate session on that. But the tenant measures are under governance. Most of you probably know that. And so there isn't a separate tenant category. It's just under governance. But the English regulator, which we're going to come on to now, is also a standalone regulator. There is a levy mind, and it does cost. Housing associations have to pay per property to fund this regulator of social housing, and they're looking at there's about 200 decent sized housing associations in England. There's actually about 800 on the books, because there's a lot of niche stuff for profits and all sorts of things. And scrutiny plays a big role, I think, in that evidence. And one of the things I took out of this, I was at a presentation from them recently, is their test to landlords, especially on customer measures, are what has changed as a result of tenant engagement at board and leadership level. What is no good just listening to tenants, what changed as a result? I think that's really important. The other thing I wanted to mention was there was two quotes I took out of the report as well. And I think they're quite pertinent, and even if it's the English regulator's view, is regulations are a floor, not the ceiling. And as TBAS Cymru very much support that. This is about the minimum standards, the minimum engagement, the minimum satisfaction levels. There's nothing stopping tenants and landlords working better to achieve that. And we've seen that in the past. And also the other thing, some of the frustrations sometimes with the regulations are, why aren't they more prescriptive? Why don't they define stuff? I remember when WHQS came out and there was engagement requirements there. People saying, why aren't they more prescriptive? The English regulator has been very, very clear on this and saying they're not great at encouraging or regulating innovation. It's got to come from your culture, from your organization. And hopefully that makes sense. So let's get into why we're here for this session. You'll see here England's different. Remember we talked about there's a governance in Wales and a financial viability, and the tenant, customer, whatever you want to call it, is built into governance. In England, it's a separate category altogether. It's only been about 2.5 years now, but it has a separate customer satisfaction level. I think that's really important. I think it's really important, and I'll show why in a minute. I'm not going to go through all the categories here. This is for reading afterwards, but in England, you would get a 3-part regulation. You might be G1, good governance, V2, viability, and you could end up with a C3, which is poor customer, metrics and engagement. Or it could be the other way around, and so you've got these 3 levels, 3 categories, if that makes sense. But that customer level is what we're going to be talking about today. What I would say, because there's local authority people here today, local authorities are not regulated in England for governance and financial. Why would they be? They've got very different governance and very different financial models, but they are absolutely regulated for those customer TSMs, customer standards. All local authorities in England are under that, as they are in Scotland. And that subject has been on and off in Wales for a while now, should local authorities come under the regulator. It's called domain regulation for the technical. And the other thing I would say is the English regulator is not afraid to dish out C3s. I haven't seen many C4s, but so C3 being below the acceptable line there. You can see it. C3s have been dished out. I was at a presentation last year, and the day before they dug out, dished out about 5 C3s in a single day. And that's made a lot of people have to look at their tenant engagement and tenant satisfaction and get improvements on it. I want to quickly mention what they are. This TSMs, what we're going to be taking lessons from today. Again, I'm not going to go through all the detail of them, but there's 22 measures. Yeah. 10 measured by landlord's data and 12 measured by the tenant's views, their perceptions. And that's more what we're going to focus on today. For reading later, if you're really interested, I've put here what the 12 ones where the tenants asked. These will be very similar to Wales, how satisfied with repairs, time taken to complete, is your home safe, all these satisfaction measures, good stuff. It's 12 of them. And the wording is quite fixed as to how you ask it. You don't have discretion to vary it. They have to follow certain guidelines and templates for those 12. So there's 12 tenants decide. And then there's 10 categories here where it's landlord data. That makes sense. It's because customer satisfaction isn't just about your opinion. It's about, are you maintaining homes? How many repairs completed within timetables? Things like this, and this is done via data collection, again, with standards. 2 things to notice on there I thought I'd just highlight is complaints relative to size of landlord and antisocial case relative to landlord. So we know, I know there's people from Travalis here, and I know there's other ones who've really gone out of their way to show tenants how to make a complaint, how to report ASB. Downside of that, and that's really good, is obviously you might get more complaints per your size, antisocial cases, and that's a good thing. We want to give tenants options, but it could actually slightly work against you in these metrics. It's only 2 of, say, 22 categories, but it's still, I think that's part of understanding data. And when you're looking at comparisons, is culture and openness, I think, is really important, but it also can reflect in the data. Hopefully, I've been talking now, but I'm going to go into why I wanted to do this session, why I wanted to run this free session, because the following bits, I thought that's interesting. And I think that's worthy of a conversation. So I'm going to go into what we've seen so far from these 2 years that this new setup's been. I wanted to mention first, though, This is not about how to manipulate or massage customers' figures, because you can take that away from you. This is about the ability to scrutinize, compare data with confidence. I want to show how different landlords are getting different results by how they're collecting, how they're doing certain things. And that makes a difference. It's that confidence. When I was talking first about the session, we were talking about the three cups game, the trying to, defraud tourists in touristy areas. What I'm trying to show here is how the game works, how data is collected, how it's done differently, how people get different results. I want you to use that for good, to educate yourself, and so you can make educated choices and understand the data. What I don't want is taking this away, like teaching the cups game and going misleading others, by changing some things so that you get better results. That's not what I want to do here today. First thing is here, channel matters. I can't emphasize this too much. I'm going to show you some figures now. Whilst the questions were fixed, I said already, what you ask, how satisfied are you with repairs, things like that. You can choose how you run the surveys, and they get very different results per channel. You probably know some of this yourself from your own work, but now they've got 2 years of data over 200 big landlords and other landlords as well. And you can see here straight away, postal surveys get higher satisfaction levels. Online, which is the cheapest one, gets the worst satisfaction levels. Now you could look at who returns a postal survey, who returns online, what type of ease of the online process, but the cheaper channels like online and SMS get lower results statistically, satisfaction levels. This isn't about response, it's about satisfying versus doing it face-to-face and postal. And consequently, some landlords have been changing their approach. So the regulator said this year there was a 5% increase in face-to-face surveys, one of the best responding ways. And consequently, some people got changed and saw better satisfaction rates. This example here, Green Square Accord, which is not far across our border, they changed from online to face-to-face, and they saw a 14% increase in satisfaction. They argue they were doing things. Others would argue it's because they changed that channel. And that's why it's so important. I think it's really important we're honest and open. And when tenants are scrutinizing and looking at data compared to others, compared to their neighbour or housing association, they understand how this stuff's been captured. And same, there is some consequence. The regulator does pull this out that face-to-face surveys don't always get the highest satisfaction rates. You might think, oh, I might get better results or anything else. But actually, two of the very highest satisfied people were using telephone, which is a mid-tier satisfaction level. But they're smaller, they have a great tenant engagement and things like that. And they're using telephones in the middle, and they are the two highest ranking ones out of all of England. The other thing I wanted to say was who asks matters. Again, only 15% of landlords conduct the service themselves. It takes resource, time, pulling people off other roles, training, all those things. It's easier to outsource to a research agency. I'm sure many of you do. What we've now seen, though, in England is that gets different results. So external contractors, external agencies generally get lower satisfaction rates from tenants compared to in-house staff. And again, all these things are, there's no right or wrong here. It just worries me that we make sure we make informed data comparisons. We understand how the data's been formed. So who asks matters. Why would we see a difference? I'd love to, at the end of this, get through this content and have a chat. Why would you see a difference? Are you more honest? Slightly negative with a researcher, or you're more favorable. We've heard this comment before from tenants. You're more favorable to a landlord if they're asking you, how satisfied are you with your home? For fear of upset or reprisals. We know that isn't a thing, but we hear tenants say that. They're worried about giving honest feedback. there's a number of things here. Does local voice make a difference? Somebody sounds like they're from Merthyr or Ynysmon or something, you know. Um, our research is more objective. I remember when I first joined the sector, there was a landlord, and when they played back the recordings, they felt that some of the people asking the questions from the staff were slightly leading. That, won't you agree that this, don't you agree, whereas researchers who are trained and objective, maybe there's less bias and less leading. So this was things I'd love to talk about after. Location matters, and local context, where you're based, is already starting to show a difference. And what I mean by that is London, particularly London. It has unique challenges: overcrowding, high density buildings, more flats rather than homes in more rural areas with gardens and things like that. You get more, when you get more tighter concentration of housing, that leads to more ASB, more noise, higher service charges because you're in blocks. Speed of repairs can be difficult in London, trying to get qualified tradespeople, and when they can charge something, the free market pays more than working for a housing association. So location is already starting to make a difference in satisfaction. And I did start to wonder whether that would be the case in Wales. Bear with me on this one. I'm going off script a bit. But new builds generally, that's another thing, get higher satisfaction than older properties. And you can understand that new builds are built to higher standards. We make good homes in Wales, don't we? We make new builds really well. And tenants often talk about winning the lottery. But in urban areas, we're building more high density homes now, anyone goes down Cardiff Bay, more high density. And I wonder, at first, will that get higher scores? But then over time, where we sometimes see ASB, service charges going up, challenges, noise, will that bounce you down? Will it be a negative drag in the future? I don't know. But it goes back to understanding the stock as well. That's another thing that matters. The other thing, sorry, we'll stop soon. Organization matters. Statistically, across the entire, I'm not picking out England, not picking out any local authorities in particular, but as a whole, councils score lower than housing associations. And I think that's a fundamental why, because I know the local authorities in Wales, there's good people doing good stuff. Why are they scoring lower? And I think it comes down to a couple of things. Is when you look at the rents they can charge and a subject called rent convergence, statistically local authorities aren't able to, are currently under the model, to collect as much rent as housing associations. And if you haven't got as much money, can you offer the same service? I don't think that's a thing. I've not seen anything to say that in Wales, and I'd be interested in local authorities' views on it. I think it comes down to comms and perceptions. You go to some housing associations, there's 3 or 4 comms people promoting the housing association, magazines and funding, all sorts of comms. Whereas I've been in some local authorities in Wales and they're having to fight to get a message out on the central council website or on the council Facebook page, And also, if you're a authority tenant, is there an unconsciousness about wider council stuff? They haven't fixed the bins or they haven't potholes in the street. Do certain tenants, drag down that good local authority housing by judging them as part of a wider council view? It's just an interesting look. Statistically, local authorities are getting much lower scores than housing associations. I think the other thing I want to mention, an ALMO, you might not know what an ALMO is, but it's very fashionable, especially in England, where, especially around stock transfer, local authorities created a separate brand and a separate management to run those local authority houses. They're still council houses, but they have a different brand to separate them out from the council a bit. ALMOs score higher than local authorities, even though they're the same thing, they're the same stock thing type thing. And I thought it was interesting that A, they score higher, but the trend in England now is to scrap Almos and just bring them back under local authority housing. If that makes sense. So the numbers are going down rapidly at the moment, but they actually were viewed with higher satisfaction by tenants. And I think that's an interesting thing about branding, you know. Do local authorities need more help, you know, from the wider local authority, from those comms team for better identity, a better branding? Denbighshire have a very distinct Denbighshire housing, you know, brand that tries to just separate them slightly out from Denbighshire Council. And maybe that's one for later. Maybe our local authority attendees might have some views on that. Because I don't think it's a difference in service. I don't see anything like that. Just think there's something about comms and how you feel about your landlord. The other thing I want to mention, size matters. The smaller you are, the higher satisfaction you get. And it's different in England. And I think we don't need to take too much into this because, you know, you've got landlords in England with 190,000 homes in one landlord. That's nearly as big as Wales' housing association stock. So these mega landlords, we're nowhere near that, but they don't get as high satisfaction as smaller landlords. Because in England, if you've got under 5,000, you're viewed as tiny. Whereas we know in Wales, we got great landlords doing great stuff with under 5,000 stock. So stock does affect your figures as well. You know, you can't compare a small niche landlord with, you know, L&Q or something in England, you know, Clarion Homes, massive, massive organizations. Oh, yeah. So the other thing also is regulation. And this is a stating the obvious, but I have to state it. Those facing regulatory action tend to get lower satisfaction levels. Now, that regulatory action could be in your finances. It could be regulatory action about your governance. But those who have got regulatory action, the regulator pulls out, generally get lower satisfaction scores. Is that because it's bad press? Or is it your poor governance, sickness, you know, lack of management, being criticized, things like that, lead to poorer service? I think that's stating the obvious to me, but I thought I'd better state it. The other thing, this is niche. This won't affect a lot of you, but those with high shared ownership stock, that affects your income. Shared ownership satisfaction levels are always, in the England model, much, much lower. So if you look there, between 10 and 20% satisfied. That's devastating, I think. That's terrible reflection on shared ownership. When you looked at some of those best in class, we're getting 96%, 94% tenant satisfaction. So shared ownership is a drag. Now, that doesn't affect, we don't have that culture in Wales as much. I looked up in the report, L&Q in England have 13,236 shared ownership properties. We've got a lot of landlords in Wales who don't even have 13,000 homes in social, never mind shared ownership. So you can see if you've got a section of your portfolio, your homes is shared ownership, and they're scoring 10 to 20%, it's a drag on there. The regulator in England is starting to produce a slightly separate table without the shared ownership, but no one goes that far down. Everyone looks at the headlines always. So, yeah, it's just, I think that's again important when you're comparing. I might be making this up now, but my understanding is Taff Housing doesn't have any shared ownership, whereas Cardiff Community does have a number of shared ownership. Now, they're very similar, operating in the city, similar, you know, size, demographics, very diverse areas. If you're comparing them, you need to be aware of those things, because if you've got a number of shared ownership, that might be impacting your satisfaction. I hope in Wales we're getting better than 10 to 20%. But the other one I want to mention is for profit. So in England, you can be a social housing provider, but for profit. and actually make keep your, they're private companies. So you have to charge social rent. You have to go through all the rules of being a social housing provider. It's interesting that they're getting slightly higher results than the benchmarks. But I looked at it in a bit more detail. They're newer, so they've bought newer properties, like it's called Section 106 properties. Their stock is newer, their tenants are newer. But they do get slightly higher results. But again, I don't think we need to worry. We don't have that in for profit in Wales, thank God, at the moment. But I do think that's an interesting observation. Does the branding make a difference? And the other thing also is complaints. Complaints, as I said already, there's a number of things here. They've got to be really carefully interpreted. And the regulator says this because we know complaints aren't a bad thing. If you've got a culture of being open and transparent and encouraging it, that's a good thing. Hiding complaints, hiding the forms, hiding how to make it is not a good thing. But you see complaint satisfaction. It's what the regulator wants to look is how satisfied were you about making those complaints and stuff. And we get a big variation at the moment in how you handle complaints, how you close complaints. And I think we're nearly at the end on this. Does time of year matter? What I mean by that is, if you fill it in the summer, it's nice and sunny, or Harry Wilson's just single-handedly won us the World Cup this summer, do you feel more positive about life? I would if Harry won the World Cup. Or if you survey in December, January, where it's freezing, I've sprung a new leak in my kitchen in the last week, damp and mold, does it matter? Actually, the truth is, no one really knows. I actually spoke to the press office last night of the regulator going, does it make a difference? And they sent me this statement last night, basically saying, large landlords, if you've got 190,000 homes, you can't just do it in a week. You can't just be the resources you need are massive. So large landlords are actually doing them all year round. And in practice, let's say they're receiving data in all the time. And so consequently, the regulator is not looked at, does it make a difference? Externally, there are people who have looked at surveys and it does make a difference slightly. There are certain points like September's better, December's terrible. No one wants to fill in survey in December. So there are some things. I'm probably going to I'll ask Caitlin to put a link in on the side. Our app is the Acuity Research. Some of you might use them yourself. They've done some some interesting stuff about does it make a difference. But currently the regulator is not looking at that because there's not a fixed point where many landlords do. So just to finish up on this, one of the things about all this is actually tenant awareness is actually pretty low about this. In terms of filling it in, they're only getting about 1 in 8 filling in these forms. And there's much more awareness. This is a quote from TVS England, from Caritas. Some of you might know him. Tenants can't hold landlords to account with this information if they don't know it exists. And I think that's the next challenge of England, because I notice how they communicate it to their tenants is very different, depending on what results they've got as well, mind, And I think there's an issue there is this is all very good, but who knows about it? Who's using it? Are people making decisions, And one thing I did notice, something this hasn't worked right, is there's now statistical evidence in the English report that the better tenant engagement you do, the higher tenant satisfaction. And I think there's more data on that, and this is something we'll look at later. But tenant engagement does improve tenant satisfaction. As TPAS, we're delighted to see that. But I think the numbers in England are starting to show that in the measures that they do. Last thing I want to mention, the perfect storm is, as you probably gathered by now, if you're a local authority based in London with large stock and you do online, that's not great for for the results they get. There are other bits, outsourcing I've mentioned already, and things like that, shared ownership. But that creates the perfect storm. And so we're seeing changes. This is a London council, Havering. They were in that perfect storm. London, large, online, they got 44%. They switched to telephone, and yes, they claimed they improved their complaint service at the same time. Of course they did, but they by switching channels and doing things, their satisfaction went from 44% to 71%. That's good, but it's also bad, isn't it? Because have they really improved, or are they just getting smarter at how to use channels to avoid the perfect storm that was dragging them down? And I think that's the point. Ian Walters, many of you know from Welsh Government. He was in a session with us last week. This is his last day today. He's retiring right now. He's probably going to his leave and lunch. But he always saw this type of data as a conversation starter, not something we go back and look at us. We've got 72 and our neighbours got 71. We're better than them. You can't say that. I think, especially in England, when you look at how this all works and comes together, it's about a lot of complicated factors. It's a conversation starter. And like the cups there, you need to understand the game when you're comparing the data. And just to say, just to wrap this up, and that's literally is my last slide. These are things that are in our tenant asks for the next government. We've got some things there about the charter that's from Scotland, which gives tenants certain rights to scrutinise, to ask certain things. It also, local authorities are included in that as well, in that transparency. I think that's really important. It's nothing local authorities can't conform to already. It's just bringing them in formally. And there's also about, should we have a separate customer satisfaction category like we do in England? I don't think the two are the best for us at the moment, where we stuff customer satisfaction under governance. And I think we'd like to see that strengthening and transparency. So I'll get off these slides and let's discuss. There was a number of things here, just a reminder, channel matter, face to face, who asks, location, the organization, the size of stock, regulation, lots of things here. And I'm going to come off it and hope you found some of that useful. I've raced it a bit, but it was just a report I was reading. And I thought, I think that's interesting. Let's do a free session to get people talking and take some away. I've not seen any of the chat yet. If there is any, does anybody?
There's quite a lot of discussion in the chat. Yeah,
right.
Very interesting stuff.
I'm going to read this from scratch. But is there anything? We're in a round table amongst friends. Does anyone want to say anything first, or put your hand up? Caitlin, can you just manage that for a second while I try and read the comments? Age, Amanda. Now, I haven't seen anything on age in the reports. There are other things out there, but not in the regulator report. They didn't comment. But you're right. That's maybe why younger people use online more. Face-to-face, if you've ever door knocked as a landlord or in politics or anything, getting people in the daytime, you're going to get, I'm going to be honest about it, older generation, aren't you, on the doorstep, especially in daytime. So anybody got any questions? Ross, do you want to help me out here? Thanks. While I try and read the questions.
Sorry, dear. I mean, there's any one of a number of places that I could have started. I think one of the places for me is that the headlines that you get back, and I'm particularly thinking, I'm not thinking of the English standards here, I'm thinking of Star Survey and things that we do in Wales. It has to be accepted that the headlines are only telling you part of the story. Because what we've got as well is, as other landlords will do, certainly if they're conducting the surveys themselves, is if your satisfaction is pulled down, and everyone's tendency will be to look at the headlines and have we gone up or down? If we've gone up, we're doing great. If we've gone down, we're all doing terrible. When it's just not the reality. And I think the access that we've now got to the raw data that's come via the organization that did the survey for us. For example, if your satisfaction has dropped by 2 or 3 points on your headline, but it's dropped significantly amongst those who live in one-bedroom properties in a particular area of the borough, and I dare say that would have been where some of those London associations may have been affected, because they're going to have high turnover in those properties, going to have all number of challenges from those tenancies and contracts. But what that prevents you doing as well is holistically changing your services when you didn't need to. What you had was a problem in a geographical area or with a particular demographic. So it's not just you've got the data from the headlines, it's how you turn that data into intelligence. I just wanted to kind of make that point. I'm sure the rest of the audience is there before I was, but just seem to keep
like I say, I think that's absolutely how you're reacting to it. Landlords should not be going from 40% to 71% in a year. Otherwise, something's, unless you really radically changed. But Farida, sorry, I can see your hand. Do you want to come in as well? And I'll start trying to pull up some of the questions on the side then. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, David. Really interesting session. So I think so I'm from local authority, Vale of Glamorgan. Really interesting in terms of the feedback from postal service surveys and online.
Yeah.
And we recently went through a SAR survey. We asked a question around satisfaction with repairs. Our STAR survey response was 81% satisfaction. Completed that exercise online recently, and we had 49% satisfaction.
Yeah.
So, I could completely relate to that. And
That's just backed up what I've just said. Thank you.
Just really trying to unpack why that has happened. And a lot of it, for me, I think it's about the cohort of people returning the surveys, the age demographics around that. But I think certainly you picked up on the comment around comms and perception. And you're right, certainly in local authorities, we are fighting for some comms visibility, and I've been able to appoint an apprentice that's going to help us with our comms recently, and it is really difficult, and we are judged by the wider context of the local authority in terms of the bins not being collected and what's happening in that wider remit of the council. So our perception is based on the whole of what is happening within the council, not necessarily just within housing. So there is something about better branding. And there is also, in terms of tenant engagement and tenant satisfaction, and I recall when I took over the role about 4 years ago, and we had a huge number of tenants attending our tenants forums, but they were just an opportunity for some of our residents to come in and talk and have some cake and talk about how poor we were, but nothing happened as a result. And we've managed to get it to be more of a kind of engaging forum where things happen, where things change, what has happened as a result of the feedback. So yeah, just to share my thoughts.
No, that's good. I agree. Especially your earlier comments about the local authority stuff, but it's also about what has changed, isn't it? My confidence slightly went out of this with the data when I started reading this English report, going, I don't have the faith now in some of these figures because there's so many variables.
Absolutely.
What are you doing about it? Why did we do change? Has the service got worse, and this goes back to those 22 metrics, looking at those metrics in detail. I'm going to pick a couple of bits off the side here. Somebody said, it might be before I mentioned it, do you think Wales might introduce the customer satisfaction elements at the moment? I think this is not a TPAS line, this is my personal line, is the regulation team in Wales is too small at the moment, and they've struggled with budget and also recruitment and things like that, the salaries they pay. And I don't think they're reluctant to do two things. One is take on local authority customer measures and also have new customer measures as a separate thing. I think because of purely resource wise, that's what I hear from internal is I think they'd love to have the customers as a separate category. We'd like to have local authorities customer bits pulled into the regulator as well, but it goes back to cost and resource. But I don't think that's good enough. And I think there is some in England, they do pay a levy, but then levy's got to be paid, haven't it? As in it comes out, that reduces your resources to do repairs, could reduce, but it depends on how much and is it noticeable. Actually, I've got some figures on it. I'll try and find them as we're talking. But England is resourced by a levy on your properties, and that's how they're able to do more and bigger and more investigation work. And they're also not afraid to dish out bad judgments, things like that. So hopefully that measures that. Sarah, your comment about local authorities didn't have a history of new builds as well, and that can affect, because people in new builds, according to this, are generally happier, that expression of winning the lottery, I thought it was a joke when I first came to us. I hear it from people who've been in emergency accommodation. They've been in all sorts of poor housing for years. They might have been in PRS before then and been evicted into homelessness. New property, and they talk about winning the lottery. You're going to be a bit more satisfied at the beginning. And local authorities didn't have that at the past. Yeah. Right, Sasha, I know anybody else want to say things? Let's have some comments and things if people have got anything they want to say. This is a chance. Alison.
Hello, how are you?
Not bad.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about timing of the survey, because we've just undertaken our staff survey it finished it in November. 2 years ago, we ran it around the same kind of time in the autumn, but we took it into kind of middle of January. I think that, timing is key. I mean, January is the most miserable month of the year for everybody, isn't it? So I think, we saw, we still had good results, but we did suspect that, perhaps that was a negative factor, just the timing of the survey. So we pulled it forward, and we concluded the survey in November this year, so we didn't let it drift, into January. The satisfaction levels are about the same. We haven't seen a huge change, if I'm honest. But what we have seen is a much stronger response rate. I think most organisations are probably thinking about doing their star surveys, maybe in that kind of Q3 time of year, in line with the Welsh Government return due at the end of February. But perhaps not a huge difference in terms of satisfaction, but certainly a much better response rate. And adding to that, we've added telephone surveys as well as the postal survey in the last 2 rounds of STAR, and that's a little bit more expensive, so getting the balance right. But obviously producing, much stronger results in, you've got the opportunity to probe a little bit more and find out, delve that little bit beneath the surface as to how people are feeling and why. So that's been an extremely useful, exercise for us.
Good. Yeah, good. And I think that timing is a little bit inconclusive at the moment. As I say, there's a link on the side there. I think Caitlin's put it in. Does it affect? There is some data on response rates versus time of year. Like I said already, December. No one's going to fill it in. No one's that on December the 13th or whatever when you're doing things. But satisfaction levels as well are different over the year. But I say there's a link there. People who want to have a look at it. Some good stuff there. Sasha, you were talking age does affect the impact as well. And I guess that also impacts channel as well, doesn't it? In terms of how many people respond versus postal, door to door. Does anyone do any door to door? Because that was really high up as well. But yeah.
Dave, just to add to that, sorry to cut in. I've lost my thing with Zoom and I couldn't find raise hand and come off mute, so I just came off mute.
Don't worry, we're amongst friends here.
We use door to door in other avenues, not just in terms of standards and measures, but we've gone out using, with some real good support from the health board in Comtaf, using techniques like appreciative inquiry, and the richness that that's given us has been outstanding. Yeah. But what I also think it does as well is it challenges some of these things that I think affect the data in other ways. So it informs people that we're separate from the local authority. It informs people that you're there to build the relationship. It informs people of where the priorities are lying. And I think what's key as well is that people will fill in the STAR survey and they know Mrs. Jones knows what Mrs. Jones has said, but Mrs. Jones doesn't know what the what the outcome, how that sits with the whole of the responses in Merthyr. So I think it's, Al and I have had this conversation over and over again of how we ensure, and it's not just something we can drive from an engagement point of view. I think it's something that the business is incumbent on communicating, is how we make star survey and other and governance outcomes and things like that. They're not a static document that sits on a shelf. They need to be live documents that drive community conversations throughout the year.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that because there's so many variables in this as well, those conversations are more valuable, I think, than just the data alone. Sasha's mentioned here they have a number of shared ownerships and market rents, and maybe hadn't thought about that drag. And I think that mention of TAF and Cardiff Community, two very similar organisations, but again, different stock makeup and things like that. These things mean you can't often compare as like for like. I think the branding as well, you mentioned, I think it was you, Ross, or somebody, about still being associated with the council. My auntie, who was with RCT Homes, could not get out in her head that she wasn't still with the council. And it wasn't until they went to Trevalis that she finally sort of accepted she wasn't a council tenant anymore. But again, used to blame them for the bins and all sorts of stuff. Just see why the reason shared ownership score lower. I've got a lot of insight. There's a Reddit forum on this that I follow, which is shared owners forum, and you look at there, it's about cost of staircasing, the selling process. Shared ownership is a good thing, but there's a lot of things aren't right there at the moment with it. I think once people are in there and are trying to exit as well. Good. Right, so I'm starting to lose some people. Are the star survey results anonymous in Wales? Does anyone want to answer that for me?
That's been answered in the chat.
Oh, it has,
well.
sorry.
There's been quite a lot of responses from people in the chat, so I think that's if there's any other answers, feel free. But it has been, people have been communicating quite well in the chat on that point.
Yeah, good. People using Acuity as well. I'd say one of the bigger players here. Does anybody, because there's so many comments here, I'm going to try and look through them, but does anybody want to just say their comment if they really want to get a view or make a point?
There's a point at the end from Sarah about managing the time and contact method is not really what tenant satisfaction is about. It's about improving services and capturing issues, and that's got quite a few reactions. So I don't know if you want to.
No, I agree. That's the point of what started me getting not angry, but a bit when I first read the report, and like that London local authority going from 41 to 71 or whatever it was now. I'm like, have they actually improved the service? Or have they just changed all their channels and how they're doing stuff? And that's quite fundamental to me, tenant engagement, tenant voice satisfaction is more than the statistics. And I don't want people getting a bonus or a raise on the fact they've changed something from 41 to 71 without really improving the service, and that's my concern. So people asking here about incentive, gift tokens, things like that. Yeah, it does increase response rate. My only concern on incentives are, having done a lot of this in the private sector for a game here, the higher the incentive, the higher the bias towards positive results. For some reason, people think if they answer better, they got more chance of winning. I know that's insane, but I did a lot of this in the private sector for a game here, and the higher the prize, the more bias you get for positive answers. And we don't want that. What's the point? But I do think smaller prizes, smaller incentives, things like that do help. Because people want to feel they've been rewarded or that they're in a chance for a small result, as long as it's not too high. That's it. Yep, more comments here. So I'm not going to go through it all now. I say I've had a chance for people. I'm going to read this and see if there's a follow-up. Like, is there time? Should we do something with the Welsh regulator now? And do a session with them. But but I hope you found this useful. As I say, it just was I was reading an article and a report over Christmas, and I was like, let's have a conversation about this. Hope you found it useful. Anything you want to do?
I'm just gonna quickly plug something. Obviously, there was
Okay.
mention from Farida about comms and increasing visibility. So I am gonna put in the link for our Better Digital Engagement series in the chat, just in case anyone would like to see what we've got going on. And if anyone would like to sign up, the link is readily available in the chat.
Yeah.
And obviously, I don't know if it's worth mentioning, there's obviously a lot more to take away from the TSM report. If you want to give it a read, it is quite interesting. And it's readily available online. If you just type in TSMs, the government's published it.
So if anyone wants the slides, we can send a recording and the slides out this afternoon once YouTube uploads it. But I'm hopefully by the end of the day, you can have the slides, the thing. Any follow-ups or anything you want me to do, you know where we are. Enjoy the rest of your lunch, the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks both. Bye.